Good morning, everyone. My name is Abhigyan Datta. I'm a graduate from Maulana Azad Medical College, University of Delhi in India. I'll be presenting on progressive supranuclear palsy today. The contents of this presentation, first, a bit of introduction, then the case presentation, then epidemiology and risk factors, pathophysiology, clinical features, diagnosis, differential diagnosis, how to differentiate PSP from Parkinson's, as uh, oftentimes PSP is misdiagnosed as Parkinson's, MRI findings, and the management. So let's talk a bit about the history and background of this disease. So the first paper on PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, was published by Steele, Richardson, and Olszewski in 1964. The cases they described were the classical phenotype. Most of them had early onset postural instability and falls, as well as vertical gaze palsy and pseudobulbar palsy. This classical phenotype is now referred to as PSP Richardson syndrome. Since then, they found that this condition is not rare actually. Even by 1972, when Steele reviewed the subject, he found 73 cases in the literature. And currently we have about 20,000 cases in the United States. So it's not that uncommon. The main problem, however, is that this disease is often misdiagnosed as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or multiple system atrophy or different, like many other disorders. So in reality, this 20,000 estimate might be an underestimate, and it might actually be even more common than recognized previously. So coming on to the case, so in our clinic, a 54-year-old male presented with a diagnosis of ALS, and his symptoms started since 2016. And this is a bit important to note. He presented with complaints of worsening painful leg muscle spasms, bilateral leg weakness, and currently his weakness is so much that he is wheelchair bound. He also mentioned that he has a history of repeated falls before he became wheelchair bound. Over the past few months, he has also started having shortness of breath as well as dysphagia to solid foods. His past medical history is significant for depression treated with sertraline, hypertension treated with enalapril, as well as diabetes mellitus. He was given metformin for that, but it was discontinued because of side effects. Personal history, he's a former smoker, and he had a tooth reconstruction surgery after a fall in 2016. So if you remember, his symptoms started in 2016, and that's when he started having falls as well. He's also allergic to penicillin. He has a family history of stroke in his parents and Parkinson in his brother. As far as treatment is concerned, he was given baclofen, diazepam, clonazepam, acetaminophen, and ketoprofen. I should also mention that this patient came to the United States from Chile with this diagnosis. So looking at these symptoms, most of these symptoms I think can be explained with ALS, the weakness, the shortness of breath, the dysphagia. However, the only thing that doesn't quite fit in with this diagnosis from the history is his onset of disease. So it started in 2016, and in ALS, the median survival time, it ranges from about 1.5 years to 4 years. So the fact that he's had this disease for 5 years now, and he's still, his condition is still not that severe. He is wheelchair bound, but he was able to come to the office and speak. So his condition was not as severe as it would be expected for someone with ALS. On examination, vitals were normal, mental status was preserved. However, he had spasticity in his face, and he had a slow effortful, halting speech. Cranial nerve exam was quite revealing. So he had bilateral exotropia. He had painful and slow eye movements, especially in the vertical direction, and slowed velocity of vertical saccades as well. Along with that, he had vertical nystagmus, impaired eye convergence, absent gag reflex. Tongue movements were normal with no fasciculation. And very importantly, he had dystonia of the neck. Uh, then moving below, he had spastic quadriparesis, more marked in the lower limbs, generalized symmetric hyperreflexia, and this was symmetric with bilateral Babinski sign. The important thing to note is that there was no muscle atrophy in any of his limbs, there was no fasciculation, and there was no rigidity. His other findings included upper limb dysmetria and equine foot deformity. Because he was in a wheelchair, his gait and posture could not be assessed. And EEG and EMG, as well as nerve conduction studies were performed, and they were found to be normal. So there was no sensory neuropathy and no conduction problems. So based on these findings, is ALS possible? Well, as far as the ocular symptoms are concerned, there have been case reports of occurrence of eye movement disorders in ALS. So there was a case in which a person had progressive ophthalmoplegia and he was diagnosed with ALS. They referred to him as a progressive supranuclear palsy variant of ALS. So based on the ocular symptoms alone, I don't think we can rule out ALS. However, the timeline of the disease, the fact that he was diagnosed with it 5 years ago and he's still fairly, his condition isn't that severe, as well as his normal EMG, and most importantly, the fact that there were no lower motor neuron signs such as muscle atrophy or fasciculation, that suggested that perhaps a diagnosis of PSP rather than ALS would be better in this case. So coming on to the epidemiology and risk factors for PSP, the age of onset is in the mid 60s and the prevalence is around 6.4 people per 100,000. This puts it at around 1% of the prevalence of Parkinson's disease. There is no racial or sex predilection. The mean survival in case of PSP is about 8 years. Most cases are sporadic. However, autosomal dominant transmission has been reported in a few cases. As far as genetics are concerned, the important thing is the H1 haplotype, which increases the risk by 5.6 times. The magnitude of this effect is comparable to the effect of apolipoprotein E4 on Alzheimer's. So this is pretty strong risk factor. And another genome study confirmed that MAPT gene variants, along with the H1 haplotype, are both associated with PSP. And the thing to note here is that MAPT encodes for a protein known as tau protein. And as we'll see in the next slide, tau protein is involved in the pathogenesis of PSP. Apart from that, there was also a Eugene PSP study conducted on veterans, and they found that lower education, firearm use, and exposure to well water and industrial waste were related to higher risk of developing PSP in veterans. Coming on to pathophysiology. So like I mentioned in the earlier slide, so the main component is the tau proteins. So there is intracerebral aggregation of the hyperphosphorylated tau proteins, and these tau proteins are the 4R tau proteins, which means that they have 4 microtubule binding repeats. So if you see here, you'll have 4 microtubule binding repeats, unlike something like Alzheimer's, in which they have, Alzheimer's is also a tauopathy, so it also has tau proteins. But in Alzheimer's, there is a combination of 3R tau proteins in which there are only 3 domains as well as 4. However, here we only find the 4R tau proteins. And currently, the only way to definitively diagnose PSP is by a neuropathological examination that shows these tau proteins. Another important thing to note is that the location of these tau proteins um, does play a big role in the clinical symptoms. So if the tau proteins are present in the brainstem, then it will produce more brainstem symptoms. If the tau proteins are present in the cortex, they'll produce more cortical signs. And for this reason, in PSP, anti-tau therapeutics are a big focus currently. Apart from that, PSP is also associated with degeneration of dopaminergic and cholinergic neurons in the basal ganglia and brainstem. And this leads to its other symptoms. So the dorsal midbrain atrophy leads to postural instability, and the cranial nerve motor nuclei atrophy leads to cerebral palsy. And the atrophy of the rostral interstitial medial longitudinal fasciculus causes the vertical gaze palsy. Coming on to phases of PSP. So most patients first have this pre-symptomatic PSP phase in which they do not have any symptoms, but they are at high risk of developing symptoms. So in these patients, if we, the only way to confirm PSP in pre-symptomatic patients is by a neuropathological examination, which will show those tau proteins that I mentioned earlier. Then the patients will progress from pre-symptomatic phase to the suggestive of PSP phase, where they will have symptoms suggestive of PSP, but not enough to diagnose PSP. And then as the disease progresses, we can have either the classic Richardson syndrome, or we can have a variety of different PSP syndromes that I'll talk about later. And these syndromes can eventually lead to Richardson syndrome as well. Now, coming on to the clinical features and the core functional domains. So as you can see, there are 4 core functional domains, and perhaps the most important is the oculomotor dysfunction. So the way the Movement Disorder Society has created the diagnostic algorithm for PSP, so they have differentiated it into 3 levels of certainty for each set of core functional domains. So for the O1 or the P1, A1, and C1, these findings are the most suggestive of PSP. And then O2, P2, A2, C2 are less suggestive of PSP, and O3, P3, A3, and C3 are even less suggestive of PSP. So the way they've divided is by creating 3 different levels of certainty, and based on the features, we can diagnose PSP. So coming on to O1, so the most specific sign I would say for PSP is the vertical supranuclear gaze palsy. This means that there is a limitation of vertical eye movements more than the horizontal ones. And the important thing to note here is that at least in the initial phases, there is intact vestibular ocular reflex. And in the next slide, I'll show you why that is relevant in PSP. O2 simply means that there is a slowed velocity of the vertical saccade. However, palsy isn't present yet. So it's not paralyzed. The eyes can move up and down, but they'll be slower than usual. And O3 is macro square wave jerks or eyelid opening apraxia. I'll explain both of these in a video in the next slide. Coming on to postural instability. So P1, or the most specific sign for PSP in this domain, is repeated unprovoked falls within 3 years of developing PSP symptoms. The next or less specific sign would be P2, in which we perform a pull test. So a pull test is a test where the patient stands straight and the examiner stands behind the patient and gives a quick forceful pull on the shoulders. So in Parkinson's disease and in PSP as well, what happens is the patient might not be able to stop himself from falling. And if he is not able to, then we take it as a positive sign. So this would be P2. And P3 is the same, except that the patient can manage to stabilize himself after taking more than 2 steps backward. The third main core functional domain of PSP is akinesia. So the most specific sign here is progressive gait freezing within 3 years. And the important thing to note here is that one, it must be progressive, and two, it must be resistant to the levodopa medication. So if we give levodopa to the patient and we find that the patient improves in terms of his akinesia, then that won't be classified as A1, because progressive supranuclear palsy is characteristically resistant to levodopa medication, unlike Parkinson. And that's one of the ways we can differentiate the two conditions. The other thing to note about A1 is that in progressive supranuclear palsy, we do not have any limb rigidity or tremor. So limb rigidity and tremor are signs of Parkinson's disease. And in a classical case of PSP, we wouldn't have that. So that's one of the conditions for A1 as well. If we have rigidity, for example, that will be classified as A2. And if we have tremor or rigidity or asymmetry or if it's levodopa responsive, then we'll classify it as A3, because these are signs that suggest that it would be more due to Parkinsonism rather than PSP. The last domain is the cognitive dysfunction domain. So the most specific sign here is the speech or language disorder. And when they say speech or language disorder, it is quite specific. So it is not something like spastic dysarthria. It is what they mean is that you have to have either something known as non-fluent primary progressive aphasia or a progressive apraxia of speech. So non-fluent primary progressive aphasia simply means that the patient is able to understand what's being said. However, when he speaks, he can use only a few words. So oftentimes he'll omit lots of words, and he'll maybe say 2 or 3 words to describe something. Progressive apraxia of speech is when the patient speaks very slowly and the speech is very effortful. And most importantly, there will be syllable segmentation. So he'll speak in like all the syllables will be like said different. Like he will say something like progressive apraxia. So there will be syllable segmentation in progressive apraxia of speech. C2 would be less specific, and these are just signs of cognitive or behavioral dysfunction. So there could be signs of apathy, there could be signs of disinhibition, there could be signs of impulsivity. And C3 is corticobasal syndrome, where the patient exhibits either cortical signs or basal ganglia signs. So basal ganglia signs of rigidity or myoclonus, or if he shows that, then that would be a part of C3 of the cognitive dysfunction. So I wanted to elaborate on the eye signs in PSP, and I would like to show a couple of videos. So we can see that he can move his eyes horizontally. However, when we ask him to move his eyes vertically, we can see that he's not able to move his eyes vertically. So this is a clear limitation of vertical movement, and this would be an example of vertical gaze palsy. Now we'll ask the patient to close his eyes as tightly as he can, because they want to exhibit something else. And what we see that he's not able to close his eyes as tightly as possible in normal patient. And the more important thing is now he's being asked to open his eyes. But notice that he is not able to open his eyes. It's almost that he has some sort of blepharospasm or something that prevents his eyelid from opening. This is known as the eyelid opening apraxia, where the patient, when he's asked to close his eyes as tightly as possible, like he does that, and then he's not able to open his eyes for a significant amount of time. This is the glabellar tap. And finally, another thing I wanted to show was the vestibular ocular reflex. So in a moment. So here the patient's head is being bent downwards. And now we can see the patient can move his eyes upwards and downwards if you look at it carefully. So voluntarily, he cannot move his eyes upwards or downwards. But when the patient's head is bent upwards or downwards, and he's asked to focus on a particular object, then he can use his muscles. So this is clearly not an example of a nerve palsy, because in a nerve palsy, he wouldn't be able to do this. But in a supranuclear gaze palsy, his vestibular ocular reflex, it remains intact. So that's one important sign of PSP. And here we're testing his convergence. So he's being asked to look at this finger, and we can see that he's not able to focus on this finger. So there is impaired convergence. Another thing I wanted to show was the square wave jerks. So these are saccadic movements, horizontal saccadic movements that look similar to nystagmus in that they will be oscillating movements. However, these are the square wave jerks. They look pretty similar to nystagmus. However, they are not nystagmus, because in nystagmus, we have normally a slow component and a fast component. So the slow component is, so the eyes will move slowly towards one side, and then there will be a corrective fast face back to its original position. However, in square wave jerks, we see that there is only fast components. There are no slow components. So it'll just shift quickly to one side, and then it will oscillate to the other side, and then it will oscillate to the other side. So there are no slow phases in square wave jerks. And this is one of the possible findings of PSP as far as eye oculomotor dysfunction is concerned. So coming on to the other signs and symptoms in PSP. So supportive findings include resistance to levodopa, spastic dysarthria, photophobia, and dysphagia. Patients can also have retropulsion. So this is due to something known as axial rigidity. So patients with PSP don't have limb rigidity, but they have axial rigidity in which there is rigidity of the central structures. And because of that, they sort of become, their posture is erect. And sometimes what happens, they have a tendency to fall backwards, and that's retropulsion. In addition, PSP patients also have difficulty walking downstairs because they cannot look downstairs because of the gaze palsy. Another important finding in PSP is the dystonia of the neck. So there is extensor rigidity, posturing of the neck. And this again relates to the axial rigidity that I was talking about. They can also have a worried expression, Babinski sign, which was present in our patient, urinary urgency and incontinence, forgetfulness, personality change, and other behavioral dysfunction. And they could also have sleep disturbances. Now for the diagnosis of PSP, we first need to check for the mandatory inclusion criteria. So this is simply what mandatory inclusion criteria for PSP do we use? So the only criteria is that the patient has to be over 40 years of age and he has to have a progressive disease. So if it's a static disease, then that's not considered to be PSP. Along with that, he also has to meet certain exclusion criteria. So if the patient has clear signs of Alzheimer's or multiple system atrophy or ALS, then that's an exclusion criteria. So the thing to note is that in ALS, there are both upper motor and lower motor neuron signs. So that would be an exclusion criteria for PSP. However, our patient only had upper motor neuron signs. So that's not an exclusion criteria for PSP. Coming on to diagnostic certainty of PSP. So we divide the diagnostic certainties into 4 sections. Suggestive of PSP, in which there are certain signs and symptoms, but we're not sure whether it's PSP. Possible PSP means there are definite signs of PSP. However, it is less specific than the ones above. Probable PSP is the highest category of diagnostic certainty that we can achieve without doing a neuropathological diagnosis. So a probable PSP diagnosis requires us to have at least one of the O1 or O2 clinical criteria that I had mentioned previously. And along with that, we need some signs of postural instability or akinesia or cognitive dysfunction. So without these, we cannot make a diagnosis of probable PSP. Now, this is just an algorithm for patients with atypical Parkinsonism features. So we can see that if a patient has dementia or visual hallucinations or cognitive, like fluctuating cognition or a REM sleep behavior disorder, then something like that is likely to be likely to be a dementia with Lewy bodies, because dementia with Lewy bodies has all these symptoms. Multiple system atrophy is also a differential diagnosis of PSP. However, in multiple system atrophy, we have signs of autonomic dysfunction, which was absent in our patient because he had normal vitals. And they also have cerebellar symptoms. So they'll have significant problem in finger nose test or any other sign of cerebellar dysfunction. Now, the difference between PSP and CBD or corticobasal degeneration is a lot more difficult to highlight, because both of these diseases can have levodopa-resistant Parkinsonism and all the signs I mentioned before. However, in corticobasal degeneration, the cortical signs and the basal ganglia signs are more predominant, and patients typically present with tremor and clumsiness of just one hand. So that's the typical presentation of CBD, that a patient comes in with asymmetric involvement of just maybe the right limb or maybe the left limb, and he will have clumsiness and rigidity, whereas PSP tends to be more symmetric, and the oculomotor dysfunction, the postural instability, these findings tend to predominate in PSP. And of course, we have the exclusion and inclusion criteria that I mentioned before to diagnose PSP more specifically. Now, coming on to differences between PSP and Parkinson, I think this is quite important because PSP is often misdiagnosed as Parkinson. So the main difference is that differences are: one, PSP is generally symmetric. So even the rigidity that I mentioned before is axial rigidity, which means it does not affect the limbs, and it is pretty symmetric. However, in Parkinson's, the typical presentation is tremor and rigidity in only one limb or only on one side. So it tends to be more asymmetric. Another difference would be that PSP is characterized by early falls, whereas in Parkinson's, falls will happen only late in the course of the disease. The third difference would be that PSP is resistant to levodopa, whereas Parkinson is responsive. In PSP, we'll have early onset of dysphagia and speech problems, whereas in Parkinson's, these will be later in the course of disease. Axial rigidity, I had talked about this before. So that's something that we see in PSP. And because of this axial rigidity, patients with PSP tend to fall backwards, whereas patients with Parkinson's, we'll often see that they are bent forwards, they're stooped forwards. And lastly, limb tremor is rarely seen in PSP. And if it's seen, it will only be late in the course of disease. And in Parkinson, tremor is obviously the most prominent feature and often happens to be the first sign in Parkinson's. Coming on to MRI findings. So there are two specific MRI findings that I want to show. So the first is referred to as the Mickey Mouse sign on axial imaging. So we can see here that because of the prominent cerebral peduncles and the atrophy of the midbrain tegmentum, this structure appears to be like, Mickey Mouse ears and his face. This is one of the specific signs for PSP. And the other sign we can see on sagittal imaging. So hummingbird sign is again because of midbrain tegmental atrophy. And because of this, we have a widened interpeduncular cistern, and this gives the appearance of a hummingbird. Now, these two were considered to be specific signs of PSP, but in recent years, we've also developed algorithms to diagnose PSP more specifically. And one of these is the magnetic resonance Parkinsonism index, MRPI. And this is basically an algorithm which will calculate the risk, the chances that someone has PSP, and it has documented more than 80% sensitivity and specificity while differentiating PSP from non-PSP patients. So this is something that might be used more commonly in the future. Other modalities for the diagnosis include PET scan, CSF biomarkers such as neurofilament light chain, and the RT-QuIC test, which is also used for prion diseases such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So these modalities are currently, they're still being tested. We are not sure how sensitive and specific they are, but hopefully they'll be better in the future. Now, in terms of the management, I want to focus on the non-pharmacological aspects because currently treatment of PSP is mainly symptomatic. We do not have any effective medications for PSP. So the first and the most important, I think, is to be a part of support groups. So in the USA, we have this wonderful organization known as Cure PSP. And in the UK, we have the PSP Association. And these are wonderful support groups that cater to the needs of PSP patients and their families. And depending on the symptoms, they can guide people towards adult daycare or home health care. And I think it's quite beneficial for PSP patients. The second thing would be to build an advisory team. So since patients in PSP have a wide variety of symptoms, it is important to have a patient-oriented healthcare team consisting of a neurologist, physical therapist, speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, and a social worker who can work together to cater to the needs of the patient, especially social worker, because as we'll see, patients with PSP have to suffer through a lot. So in terms of lifestyle tips, and this applies to many other diseases as well. So PSP can affect the bladder. Like I said, they can have symptoms of urinary incontinence and urgency. And in the elderly, oftentimes bladder infection might also have similar symptoms. So we need to educate people about the signs of bladder infection so that they can differentiate between the two. And we need to encourage them to take plenty of fluids as well. The another issue with PSP is that oftentimes patients with PSP have constipation, and so we should recommend them fluids, fiber, and exercise for this. Now coming on to the main problem for visual problems. So patients who cannot look down and read through the bifocals are recommended to hold the reading material higher to the level of the eyes, so that when they read the eyes, are positioned straight ahead rather than down, and that might help them to read. Patients who have impaired convergence, like in our patient, for them, I think for them, the special prism glasses would be very helpful for them. Patients who have blepharospasm and apraxia of lid opening can be treated with Botox injections, and lubricants for dry eyes can also be given. Now in PSP, the most important thing that we should be aware of is that we should ensure that the patient has good oral hygiene. This is because patients with PSP often have swallowing problems, so they'll have dysphagia. And oftentimes what this leads to is that we can get aspiration pneumonia in these patients. And aspiration pneumonia is the #1 cause of mortality in patients with PSP. So maintaining good oral hygiene via regular dental checkups, fluoride dental paste, and an electric toothbrush is quite crucial. In many cases, patients still continue to have aspiration pneumonia despite all these precautions. And in these patients, a feeding tube or a gastrostomy might be indicated. Because of their postural instability and their akinesia, PSP patients also have mobility issues, and physical therapy as well as weighted walking aids are quite beneficial for them. They can also be advised changes to their house, such as bed rails, chair and bed risers, motorized lift chairs, and specialized wheelchairs. And we should encourage them to be more active and mobile. So so they can do this by playing with their grandchildren, walking, doing yoga. And probably the best thing would be to swim, because when you're swimming, there is no fear of falling, and the water will increase the weightlessness, so it's easier for them to exercise. So swimming is probably the best exercise for patients with PSP. Since most of them are wheelchair bound, we should also always assess them for pressure sores whenever they come to the clinic. Then there are speech problems for which speech therapy is recommended. And some patients with PSP also, what happens is that their voice becomes in terms of amplitude, so they'll have quite low amplitude when they speak, and it's quite hard to hear them. So in that case, personal voice amplifiers are quite useful. And lastly, we should always check for mental health issues in these patients. We should assess for depression. We should counsel them. And we can also train the caregivers because many a time these patients may be more agitated or disinhibited, and they might be more aggressive towards their families. And we should train the caregivers not to overreact to outbursts. In terms of pharmacologic treatment, levodopa is not very effective. And in fact, prolonged and marked improvement with levodopa therapy is an exclusionary criteria for PSP diagnosis. It makes Parkinson diagnosis more likely rather than PSP. Then one study found that zolpidem might improve the ocular symptoms such as gaze palsy, and it can also help with the sleep disturbances that are seen. Mirabegron can be used for urinary incontinence. For depression, we can use SSRIs and tricyclic antidepressants. In terms of apomorphine, so trials are still ongoing for subcutaneous apomorphine. We haven't had the results out yet. However, a lot of clinicians do try out this medication in the hope that it might be effective. And lastly, I talked about the importance of tau protein in the pathogenesis of PSP. And there's been a lot of research on anti-tau therapeutics. So broadly, these can be classified into two categories. So the first category are the GSK3B inhibitors. So these inhibitors, this is a kinase basically, which hyperphosphorylates tau protein, and the hyperphosphorylation of tau protein would normally lead to the aggregation of tau protein and the symptoms. So if we can prevent the hyperphosphorylation, we can possibly prevent the symptoms. So one such medication is sitagliptin, which does exactly this. However, we are not sure of the efficacy, and trials are still ongoing. The other would be monoclonal antibodies. So we have gosuranemab, which is a monoclonal antibody against tau proteins, and trials are still ongoing. So to summarize, we don't really have any good therapy for PSP currently, and management is mostly symptomatic. So before we end, I'd just like to summarize. So the PSP, or progressive supranuclear palsy, is characterized by symptoms in 4 core functional domains. Firstly, oculomotor dysfunction, in which vertical supranuclear gaze palsy is the most specific finding. The second is postural instability, which could be manifested as repeated unprovoked falls. The third is akinesia, a progressive gait freezing. And the fourth is cognitive dysfunction in the form of speech or language disorder. As far as differentiating it from Parkinson's is concerned, early onset of postural instability and falls, early onset of dysphagia and speech problems, absent or minimal limb rigidity and tremor, resistance to levodopa, and symmetric involvement help it differentiate from Parkinson's. Genetically, it is associated with H1 haplotype and MAPT gene, and pathophysiology is related to tau proteins. It's a clinical diagnosis. We diagnose it mainly by the symptoms, and these findings are supported by our MRI, which can show the signs that I mentioned before. And treatment, there is no effective treatment. The management is primarily symptomatic. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.